Hello, and a very, very warm welcome to this fourth session. Today, we're going to be looking at liberalism and liberal institutionalism. And just before I go into the slides, I just want to make this point. When I go through each of these theories, I want you to think about what are the interesting points, what are the assumptions, what are the strengths of each of these theories, and also try to consider what are the limitations. Of course, I am doing this in this presentation partially for you, but I want you to be thinking as you go through this presentation, think carefully about some of the key points that I make about each theory. And as you know, I'm going to be promoting or selling each theory to you. So because at this stage, I don't want you to think, oh, this is the theory that I believe in, end of story. I want you to keep an open mind. And by the end of this module, you should have a better sense of a range of different theories and how they apply to issue areas moving forward. So without further ado, what I'm going to do now is share the screen with you. And we're going to continue with liberalism and liberal institutionalism. And again, I start off with an image like I have in previous presentations. This image, I will just give you a second or two to have a think about. But again, the title of this presentation is Liberalism and Liberal Institutionalism. So I'm going to look at liberal values, how they work, and I'm going to look at notions of institutionalism and how institutions themselves work, etc., etc. And what better way to start than with a picture, and this has a connection with the first and second presentation, of the United Nations headquarters in New York. And some of you perhaps have guessed that. This is the headquarters, the outside of the building, so the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly that you've already seen, and the Secretariat and so forth. That's part of this headquarters in New York. And this is an important image in terms of what I want to look at today, excuse me, for the simple fact in the post-Second World War context, various state actors, and particularly powerful ones if you're a realist, but various state actors, and increasingly now non-state actors, but various state actors created a particular global order that arguably was built upon liberal aspects. Of course, there would be realists and critical theorists that would critique that, but I'm going to make this argument today from a liberal perspective. And here we want to look at notions of institutionalism, which is an important fact for you as IR and political science students to think about, how institutions create or potentially create a pooling of resources, sharing of information, and more interdependence, and therefore create a more peaceful outcome, or at least that's the hypothesis. Okay, now to start off with, I'll give some historical context and again some leading thinkers like I did with realism. And I'm just going to put my own image to the top so you can see the whole of the slide in terms of all the wording. So liberal internationalism. So let's hear, I've got a couple of very, very significant Enlightenment thinkers and the influence they have had in the subsequent 250 years, what have you. And the Enlightenment period from 1660 to 1790, more or less, the end of the 18th century, what have you. Here, basically, you have to consider there was a range of European thinkers who basically made the point that one can think for oneself. So you don't need an authority, a man with a beard, to tell you, oh, I have this connection with God, and therefore I'm telling you what the truth is, nothing but. No, you need to supere aude, dare to be brave, think, and in this case, dare to know, supere aude, that's Immanuel Kant's famous phrase. I'm going to come to him in a second, but dare to know. So these Enlightenment thinkers said that we all human beings, have an innate ability to think critically and rationally. And this is the premise of the Enlightenment. Of course, there are challenges to this notion of what I've just said. And of course, there are those who critique this notion, because this was a lot of, and John Stuart Mill, another significant liberal thinker who we'll come across later, also referred to non-European states at this point in time, in the 19th century when he was working. A very, very significant liberal thinker, John Stuart Mill, on liberty, but also referring to non-Europeans as barbarians. So there was a mixed bag aspect to him, nonetheless on the domestic agenda, very progressive. But the point I want to say is that these are some of the key ideas and principles that we need to think about liberalism and some of the key ideas and where they've come from. So Immanuel Kant, the great Prussian Enlightenment thinker, as you can see the date of when he lived, and the key text or essay that I want to refer on is Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch written in 1795. And again, this aspect, sapere aude, dare to know, Immanuel Kant here, he's looking at political and legal and social aspects, and also the transformation of individual consciousness, because the individual is front and center to liberalism. Yes, an individual can be part of a community, of a nation state, but the individual also has to think for him or herself and actually play an important role in instigating a better society, whether it's, let's say, improving civil rights in a whole host of different ways, or let's say thinking about how you can create a better economic order. So first and foremost, it's the transformation of the individual consciousness. There is ethical components here on deontological components that Kant writes about in other works, where an emphasis of basically a duty-based making the right decision with the right intention, etc., etc. But here I want to emphasize, so there's an deeply ethical component to Immanuel Kant, but here we're looking at how the individual consciousness can be transformed to think in a way that actually improves also society. Secondly, Republican constitutionalism, creating institutions that have a constitution that is representative of the people. So representing the people so that they have a voice, so creating political and legal institutions where there is a fair say for all individuals, and also individuals, the citizens that make up a polis. So again, we can go back to ancient Greek thought. Kant is extremely significant. Hannah Arendt of the 20th century too. Quentin Skinner, a British thinker of the late 20th, early 21st century. Machiavelli even, who I referred to in a previous set of slides. So Republic constitutionalism. And in international relations theory, and the emphasis that I should always remind you that I'm focusing in on, you have two significant thinkers in the late 20th century who wrote about this notion of democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory, DPT. Democratic peace theory, DPT, in case you hear me saying it in the future. Michael Doyle and Bruce Russett, two important American political scientists. And their point is, and they looked at a range of different empirical studies, case studies, and they looked over 120 years, and they came to what they consider almost a law-like generalization that two democratic nation states do not go to war with one another. Or the hypothesis would be something like democratic states have never or have almost never gone to war with one another. You would have to look at the empirical data to see if in all cases that's the case. And realists and other theorists could critique this. But nonetheless, there is something to this theory, democratic peace theory, in that actually democratic states are more peaceful with one another. And this is in one of the readings that it's not my main reading I've set for you, but International Relations Theories textbook, Discipline and Diversity, is this notion of dyad. So that two state actors and their relationship can be peaceful if they are democratic. However, what it's not saying, monad, is it's not saying that liberal states are more peaceful per se. In all cases. So, for example, liberal states are not necessarily inherently more peaceful in one sense. Yes, liberal thinkers promote liberal ideas, and there's many positive aspects to liberalism, and even realists would make that point. Yes, that they are for democracy and human rights and so on, but of course they're critical of that you can instigate it in other states, societies, what have you. But for liberals, this notion of democratic peace theory, it actually promotes a better system and a better exchange. However, liberals acknowledge that, let's say, the United States or the United Kingdom or France, whatever the case might be, going to war in the Middle East or some other part of the world, some other region, these are the United States, United Kingdom, France, liberal democracies, and yet they are warlike or militaristic in some contexts. So this is monad. It's not saying that liberal states are inherently more peaceful in terms of their international relations, not necessarily at all, or not. It's not the case in many, as we can see. However, this notion of, or this concept of democratic peace theory is an important aspect that Doyle and Russert have written about in the late 20th century, influenced by Kant. And a final one, a federal contract and agreement. So here we have international law quite explicitly between states to abolish war. An agreement, and over time, these laws, these rules, these regulations, norms even of what's appropriate, becomes in place and creates peaceful conditions between different actors, state actors. Excuse me. But as we can see, that has not often been the case in all regions of this world since the time that Kant's written. But nonetheless, this is important thinking for liberal thinkers of today, and actually spreading this to other parts of the world, for better or worse. Okay, now another very significant thinker who you come across in political economy, global economy, actually an ethical scholar, the Scottish moral philosopher Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. One of his great works, although some consider it his magnum opus, is The Wealth of Nations. And right-leaning neoliberal economic thinkers, and sometimes left-leaning progressives in their other way, because they say he's been misinterpreted, but he's a doyen for a lot of economic thinkers over the last 250 years, that they constantly refer to his work. The Wealth of Nations. I'm going to refer to why it's significant again for international relations, but you'll come across Adam Smith in global economy and other classes too. So The Wealth of Nations, 1776. And here I'm just going to read a quotation. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So I'll read it a second time. He intends only his own gain, and he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So here it's following this quotation looks at self-interest. You follow things, you don't know what the outcome's going to be, but if you achieve it for yourself, it can have a benefit for a society in terms of goods and services, and it can help the economy, etc., etc. Now, Adam Smith, and there's been other works and has been challenged, those on the right take this literally and say it's all about being self-interested, in case selfish can be a good thing. On the left, they say he's been misinterpreted, because you can see other works or other aspects of this work where actually Smith was not talking about, let's say, business exchanges always in such a positive light, in terms of that he was making the case on a small scale, this is what took place. But anyway, the key point here, and also when businesses become too powerful, that they can become monopolistic. But anyway, the key point here that I want to emphasize about Adam Smith, and these debates we can always think about for future reference, is this notion of the invisible hand, laissez-faire mechanism. So this notion that actually you can't see it, but by you interacting, you producing a certain good or a certain service, you can promote to a certain prosperity of a society, of a state. And this is what generates progress and prosperity, according to this liberal thinking. So liberal states like the US, Japan, etc., supposedly are promoting this invisible hand. Again, in the 20th century, you have thinkers like Milton Friedman, more right-leaning libertarians who make the point very strongly for government deregulation, and more, let's say, centrist or centre-leaning Keynesian thinkers, John Maynard Keynes himself, and later on people like Stiglitz and so on, say that there needs to be a role for government and regulation. But the key point here is there needs to be a certain amount of freedom in providing the mechanism for people to trade and interact. Next one, free trade, and this is very important for liberals. The free trade, let's say, breaking down barriers. So the more there's interaction, more there's trade between different actors, state and non-state actors, the more you create prosperity. And remember the term absolute gains, a win-win situation. And the more that becomes interdependent. And that's Richard Cobden's work of the 19th century, but I'm going to particularly focus on liberal institutionalism later on. However, and this is a critique of those who take Adam Smith as saying it's all about self-interest and selfishness, some neoclassical economists using just everything about self-interest. He was writing in tendencies, not absolutes. So as a nuanced, rich thinker, Adam Smith looked at things, largely speaking, in the round. But again, free trade is a very, very important notion that we need to think about as we go through this presentation. And Adam Smith is a major thinker in this area. So now I want to take us to some evolution here. And I want to make this point of coming into the 20th century, the importance of Woodrow Wilson here. Again, Woodrow Wilson, as you may have seen recently, has been criticised as, and understandably, a post-colonial critique of him because of his racist views and so on. And his statue has been taken down, I believe, in Princeton University, which he was head of once upon a time. However, I just want to focus in on liberalism. So when his presidency, also as you can see during the First World War, and an important part of Treaty of Versailles, and his own sort of like failure to get the Senate to agree to his own 14-point plan. But the key point here that I want to emphasize of the 14 points is the following. He basically, as a thinker, said that actually this notion of international anarchy that realists talk about and emphasize, we live in the supranational institutions, supranational authority can't protect us, so we need to be able to survive. We need to be able to survive and maintain our security. This is according to realists. Well, actually, then, according to Woodrow Wilson, you need institutions and an international institution and institutions to actually facilitate information sharing, dialogue, to actually facilitate potentially better relations between between state actors. And it couldn't, therefore, let's say, diplomacy has often been thought of in this bilateral, sometimes multilateral way of silent or very secretive deals made between heads of states and diplomats. Well, actually, things should be much more transparent, open for the public to hear about. And again, critiquing in here realism, a blind faith in this notion of balance of power, equilibrium that realists go on and about. But actually, according to Woodrow Wilson and his notions of his aspects of liberalism, actually domestic society and how it works actually is not necessarily separate from international society. And later on, the English school and aspects of constructivism also look at this, but you can have an international society where there's systems of governance. The English school, by the way, and constructivists are not liberals per se, that they would be more agnostic about what sort of order you create, politically speaking, in the world. But the point is, you can have an international society with rules, norms, systems in place. And according to a liberal, that would be democratic procedures. And here, when you think of global governance, you think of liberal global governance, you can think of creating institutions, whether you're more right-leaning or left-leaning, but creating institutions that actually represent many different actors and the societies in question. And this was something that Woodrow Wilson was emphasizing also in his own arguments. So now I want to talk about liberalism, get to some key points of liberalism with you. So liberalism, and I've put in red on purpose. So again, we're going back to Immanuel Kant here, but again, think of this today in the 21st century and how it works today. So this Kantian perspective is a critique here of realism, but not necessarily. And this is where you have to see the nuance and sometimes a relationship between the different theories, a type of eclecticism. But nonetheless, of course, we have to differentiate how the theories are different. But here you can see he's not saying that sovereign states are not to exist and they're not going to have certain interests and so on and so forth. However, what Kant is arguing is that there are ways of going beyond, let's say, just the self-interest, balance of power politics, and getting beyond the security dilemma, etc., which we came across in the last set of slides. And here are three important notions for this Kantian perspective. First is that democratic government and governance actually creates potentially more peaceful relations between different, especially democratic societies. And the European Union is an interesting example here because it's emphasized the Copenhagen criteria, it's emphasized democratic governance, rule of law, market economy, etc., etc. These are liberal notions that the European Union expound upon and arguably creates more intertwining, more interdependence. And here, also Adam Smith here, Richard Cobden of the 19th century, etc. Economic interdependence. The more countries trade with one another, the more they become dependent on one another, and the more it becomes costly and painful to break this up. Now, you might say right now, oh, but look at the United States and China. So the Trump administration's relations with China and how this has made things arguably worse for both sides, or it's made it much more realist and, in a sense, zero-sum thinking of the Trump administration. But the point is, according to liberals, economic dependence is the sort of situation where you would actually create more peaceful relations, but also sometimes not just between democratic states, but also between sometimes an authoritarian state like China, that the more the US and China interact, the more it creates peaceful conditions and less likely they would come into some sort of conflict or absolute worst case scenario, war. And international law is important. That actually, yes, there are powerful state actors, but actually international law creates a system where there is a voice also for those who, let's say, who are smaller states, so not as powerful, that they have a voice, and overcoming the so-called security dilemma. Now, let's look at some changes. And there's been large changes in the last 100 years in terms of, there has been actually, according to liberals, a movement forward. So there has been actually a reduction in conflict. And of course, here we'd have to look at the empirics, we have to look at different cases, we have to consider this in the round, but these are contentions that liberals make, that there's been a reduction in conflict. And secondly, a decline in autocracies, or put another way, a vast increase in democracies over the last, again, 30 years, 60 years, 100 years, depending on which historical context we want to start off with. Secondly, much more economic interdependence, much more trade and interrelations, etc. And the increase, as we saw from United Nations slides, much more of an increase of intergovernmental organizations. So much more interaction, pooling of resources. And for liberals, this is good because you actually create the facility or the possibility, you facilitate potentially better and more peaceful relations. And again, liberals focus on the individual, but focus on the ideas of liberty and equality. Equality is not the way Marx sees it, or Marxists or some critical theorists talk about actually equality also in terms of economics and economic outcomes, etc. No, it's more in a sense that liberals have certain opportunities, and given these opportunities, they can make a life for themselves, etc., etc., but equal amongst, under the eyes of the law, and so forth. And this is important, the individual plays an important role in this worldview, in this political philosophy. And liberalism in international relations. So democracy can constrain conflict by two means. Again, force of norms shared by actors. Norms, what is considered appropriate? Our identity, who are we, and how do we consider ourselves, let's say, a particular way? If we consider ourselves liberal democracy, we would not therefore feel it appropriate to go and attack another liberal democracy. We would feel it appropriate that we would deal with it through exchange, through diplomacy. When we bring in norms, by the way, we are starting to go in the direction of constructivism, next set of slides, where we consider what's appropriate. Why is it, for example, that one constructivism now, why is it one deems a particular relationship, a social relationship between myself and another state, where I could be a state now, state A, state B, or non-state actor, to a non-state actor or to a state actor, whatever the case is. But why is it that, let's say, I feel it appropriate to do certain things in terms of my interaction with another actor, if I consider that other actor a friend or a competitor or an enemy? I'm going to react differently depending on my relationship, my social relationship. So liberalism, this is where you start getting in the direction of constructivism, but liberals say the force of norms. Liberal democracies are not going to go and attack. So hypothetically speaking, tomorrow the United States could attack Barbados, let's say, as an example, but it wouldn't. Why? Because it wouldn't be appropriate. Yes, it could in terms of power politics, but there are certain things that constrain it, and there are institutions in place. There is, let's say, in the case of the United States as the example, Congress and legislative bodies and so on. Again, some of the critical theorists out there amongst you, or the democracy, the realists might say, well, yes, but look at the Cold War, and even post-Cold War, the United States has invaded countries, etc., that had democratic leadership. This is a point, and this is a point of discussion that we can have. But broadly speaking, democracies, they're shared by different democratic actors, and norms of what's right, what's wrong, plays an important role, what's appropriate, based on one's identity, if we talk about it in a constructivist way. And these democratic institutions constrain leaders. So again, the legislative branches of a system, let's say in the US or in the UK or in Germany, in Japan, whatever the case might be, Parliament, Congress, will constrain public opinion, and various other, let's say, actors, state and non-state actor, means that you can't. If you're a totalitarian actor, you can just say, okay, I want to go to war, and there's not too many institutions that can block it. Well, actually, this is why supposedly democracy constrains actions from taking place and leaders deciding to go to war willy-nilly. Of course, and this is an important point, this is not always the case, but this is the hypothesis that the liberals make. Okay, and again, international trade, referring to Adam Smith again, and others, and 20th and 21st century economists make the point that actually international trade, whether neoclassical or Keynesian, they were similar in this point, actually international trade can result in greater mutual understanding, and this expectation of peace is facilitated, is developed, and there's more interdependence, more sharing of ideas, but in this case, obviously, goods and services, and it creates potentially better relations, more peaceful relations. And international organizations, and we'll be looking at liberal institutionalism shortly, it helps to mediate conflict. Because why? It pulls resources, it reduces uncertainty. If we are interacting, it's iterative process. The more we interact with each other, we share information. There's this idea that information's out there. So this helps shape norms, and it can generate narratives, constructivism again, of mutual identification, that we're in this together, that we need to see each other. So a story we tell ourselves, constructivism, that we tell ourselves that we need to actually see each other in a certain light to work together. And for this, and here, this is now I want to take, so you remember on the first set of slides, I spoke about liberalism. And now I want to go into liberal institutionalism / neoliberalism. One thing I want to say about neoliberalism is don't confuse it from the economics term. So the economics term neoliberalism, which I spoke about in the first set of slides, privatization, deregulation, a so-called mantra that's taken place really from the late 1970s, 1980s, especially to 2008. So this is economic neoliberalism. So a deregulation of let's say, governance in terms of economics, allowing more and more private capital investment, etc. This is not exactly what Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye and other significant neoliberal thinkers are arguing in international relations. So IR neoliberalism and economic neoliberalism, not the same thing. But let's say liberal institutionalism, in how it's used in the theory, liberal institutionalism / neoliberalism. So we can use this now as a synonym. Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye will now be going into their work, and other significant scholars. So in the early 1970s, again, I refer to these two names, which you'll see later, Robert Cohen of Princeton University and Joseph Nye of Harvard, and worked also in the Carter and Clinton administrations, famous also for notions of soft power and smart power. Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye were looking at the world around them as scholars, and were looking at it and looking at political economy, and they were saying, look, the state centrism of realism or neo-realism that comes in the late 70s, as you know, actually, we've forgotten about the economic dynamics to international relations. This is a big blind spot that liberals. So yes, according to Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, yes, it's true. We accept the premise that states are self-interested. And this is what differentiates them from some liberals who say, from some more critical approaches to international relations we come to, this premise of self-interest. This is where constructivists, but also critical theorists, feminists, post-structuralists challenge this notion of self-interest being front and center. But liberal institutionalists agree with or accept the premise of neo-realists that actually and realists more broadly, of self-interest. But they say there's a lot that's missing. because there's economic dynamics. Secondly, we have to think about cooperation. Why is it the case that, yes, there is conflict in the world, but why is it the case that there is also cooperation between different state and non-state actors? And key for us as neoliberals or liberal institutionalists is, how do we achieve better relations, more cooperative relations between states, but also other actors? Because we need to bring in non-state actors, multinationals, non-governmental organizations, social movements, etc., etc. And yes, we might accept, so Bob Cohen, Joseph Nye, accepting the Kenneth Waltz's notion that actually cooperation can be difficult to achieve. But actually, as you see, the growth of international institutions and international regimes, rules, norms, processes can actually over time facilitate dialogue, information sharing, and creates over time at least more peaceful relations, or creates that possibility. And this is an important difference with neorealism. So again, complex interdependence. And here I put myself to one side because it's more important to the image. Okay, Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye, significant thinkers, complex interdependence. And you can see an image and you see different parts. If you look on the right, you can see food insecurity. Further down, you can see climate change. If you go to the left, you can see geopolitical tensions. If you go up into the center of the image, you can see global economy. And if you go all the way to the left of the image, you can see financial instability. And what basically this is doing, this image, it's basically saying to us, actually, you can see how each of these different elements have a connection. There's a cobweb, there's an interaction. If, let's say, climate change, there's an issue of climate change, this can create environmental refugees, or it can lead to financial instability, or it can actually cause a problem for the global economy. And the global economy, therefore, needs to be able to adapt. Likewise, climate change can lead to droughts, floods, and disasters, which leads to food insecurity, which leads to et cetera, et cetera. Again, financial geopolitical tensions can have an aspect of terrorism, which can lead to financial insecurity. But you can see how everything is interconnected. It's not all doom and gloom, and for liberals, it certainly isn't doom and gloom, because there is a facility for, let's say, trade, prosperity, peaceful coexistence, peaceful relations. But nonetheless, what I'm trying to emphasize in this slide, or what Cohen and Nye particularly emphasize, is, let's say, this cobweb, this interrelationship, which really, so you need to look at things in an interconnected, holistic way, as opposed to how realists see it, where they see it, this emphasis on the politico-military relations. Here you can see a whole range of different factors. And now that that's said, I want to just talk about some assumptions that Bob Cohen, Joseph Nye, and other important thinkers have in this area. So liberal institutionalism, neoliberalism, their assumptions. So individuals and states, they're rational. So here they accept this rational choice premise that there's an actor, got self-interest, does a hierarchy of preferences. If I get one, I go for one. If I go for two, I go for two. If I go for three, I go for three. But nonetheless, and again, when we come to constructivism and the more critical theories, we'll see how this idea of self-interest is problematic, that we go beyond it because of how we perceive ourselves and others. But nonetheless, individuals, states, non-state actors, though rational, have the assumptions and this is where they accept the liberal premise that actually are rational. Where they disagree with the realists is that actually you can solve problems through collective action. Collective action is another concept that we connect with economics. And this notion that actually, if we all work together, we can achieve a positive outcome. But what is the case when a state or a non-state actor decides to free ride? Free ride is this notion, so a free rider problem is this notion that a state, or sometimes a non-state actor, or sometimes you as an individual, for instance, if you go on the tram here in Karlsruhe and you don't pay for your ticket, I'm sure none of you would ever do that. You would always pay for your ticket, but you are having a free ride, literally. You are benefiting from others paying into the system, like paying taxes, another example, but you benefit from it without putting anything in, so to speak. And this is what happens at a more, let's say, macro level between states. When a country, let's say, benefits from the generosity, supposedly, of others, it's free riding. And how do you solve this? How do you get all state or non-state actors to agree to, let's say, reducing carbon dioxide? Or NATO now, international security, and this is not just the Trump administration, how do you get states all to sign up to 2% of, and it's a controversial question, contentious, but how do you get all states to sign up to 2% of their GDP for military expenditure that contributes to NATO? So this is, how do you get everyone to sign up to it so that they are not free riding? And this is known as the collective action problem in economics, economic institutionalism. But by sharing information, working closely, you can actually overcome the collective action. And here there are other constructivists would argue about how narratives play an important role, storytelling. But for liberal institutionalists, neoliberals, there has to be more interaction of states, non-states. And this is, by doing this, you can get everyone to sign up to something. But it's difficult, as we can see when you try to have environmental, a climate change, let's say, treaty on the environment or financial or some other area. It's not easy, and nation states and non-state actors can actually free ride. International cooperation is mutually advantageous, and it's desirable, and it's possible. Contra realists, actually neoliberals, say yes, it's difficult, but actually, as we can see, it benefits all. Absolute gains. It's a win-win situation, and we can do it, and it's possible, and we can see evidence of it in this world, because we can see a lot of positive things in the world. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all war and famine, etc. People have got better off. People are actually living in more peaceful lives, etc. So again, liberal institutions, neoliberals, contra realists, they would say, look, it's not just all about states. Yes, states are very important. But actually multinational corporations, and here you can see where Marxists or critical theorists would bring this in too in a different way. Multinational corporations are extremely, MNCs are extremely important. Microsoft, Amazon, Siemens, ExxonMobil, Toyota, etc., etc. Religious and nationalist movements. What about ideas, norms? We'll get to constructivism next time. Whether one's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, these belief systems may play a role. Of course, we shouldn't simplify, and political actors use religion for positive or negative reasons, as we know. But nonetheless, we have to look in at the religious and nationalist movements, the role of nationalism. Yes, hypothetically speaking, we want to at some stage challenge nationalism and come to some sort of more cooperation. But can we ever? Because nationalism is always there front and center. And that's according, of course, to realists. And states cannot be, but again, from liberal institutionalists, neoliberals, states cannot be conceptualized as unified actors. There's so many, it's multicentric or polycentric, or if we use Robert Dahl, the American political scientist, of pluralism, actually there's many different senses, many different relations, and it's not the case that the elites are always there and have complete control of every situation. It's a much more complicated aspect, and there's lots of different pressures, both on a domestic and international. So it's intermestic in many ways, to use the term that liberals use, intermestic, between domestic and international. And power within the international system, likewise, this liberal institutionalist neoliberal perspective is much more diffuse and fluid. So for realists, it's much more centered, the powerful actors, and they have an equilibrium, balance of power. No, if you can see with these different state and non-state actors, power is diffuse and fluid, and sometimes it's asymmetrical, and therefore we can see how different actors work within the system, and that actually it's not the case that always the most powerful are in control of the situation, etc. Liberal democratic states do not wage war upon one another. The doctrine of democratic peace theory, DPT, this Kantian notion of Michael Doyle and Bruce Russett. So this doctrine of the democratic peace that we've touched upon previously, this is an important assumption for liberal institutionalists, neoliberals. And military force, yes, self-interest, and yes, it's a part of the equation, but it's only a part of the equation. There's many other ways of doing foreign policy and international relations. And again, trade, whether we look at the economics, social, environmental. When we look at ECOSOC, for example, in the United Nations, liberal institutionalists and neoliberals promotes a lot of these different bodies and agencies for that reason. And again, absolute gains rather than relative gains. Absolute gains rather than relative gains. So again, I'm going to just focus here on liberal institutionalism, neoliberals. Both sides can benefit from an interaction, from trading with one another, from pooling resources, as opposed to one relative gains that one side gets more than the other, then it's in a stronger position. No, for liberal institutions, neoliberals, both sides can benefit from an interaction, from trading together, etc. And again, liberal institutions, neoliberals, they adopt a state-centric perspective. So contra previous liberals, they accept that, yes, the state is front and center. So if you are Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye, you say to yourself, okay, I accept, for example, that there is going to be some sort of aspect where the state has to be considered this way. So we sign up to this rational choice approach, that states are unitary, that they're rational, that they do the cost-benefit analysis, they have access to perfect information, or more or less. This is rational choice theory, and they do a hierarchy of preferences. Go for one, you get it. If you don't get one, you go for two. If you don't get it, you go for three. And if you don't get three, maybe you don't go for it. And you try to get the most you can out of a situation. Utility maximization, utilitarianism thinking comes from the 19th century. The happiness principle, getting the most for yourself. But here, it's heavily indebted to microeconomics, this particular point. So they accept some of the premises of neo-realists, that we have unitary, rational, utility maximizing actors. But again, they also say that non-state actors play a role, who also have some of these the unitary rational, utility maximizing actors. So they are not like the idealists in the interwar periods that say, okay, let's just create institutions and everything will be good. No, they accept that you need that the world can actually have very negative outcomes. They're not the idealists of the interwar period, but they still see the possibility for progress more so than what neo-realists do. Why? Because incrementally speaking, we can improve things. And again, I've said that they're not idealists, but actually we still can. Whether we look at, let's say, the environment or economics or some other issue, we can improve things despite the fact that we live in an anarchical environment. We accept that premise, but we can still do better. And actually, yes, an advanced international division of labor, but it requires an intricate web and actually interaction and the cooperation. Actually, over time, also developing countries can become wealthier. When we look at Marxism, we can see actually how it just instigates, or structural Marxism, how it instigates a hierarchy. And realists also acknowledge in some ways a hierarchy in this sense. But for liberals, yes, there might be a hierarchy, but actually the more you interact with each, you can actually help others and help developing countries also become wealthier. And it can therefore be beneficial for all, more a trade advantageous. So this protectionist thing of putting barriers up between states, protectionism, is problematic for liberal institutionalists, or for liberals generally speaking. And complex interdependence, how these different, let's say, areas are intertwined, interconnected. Yes, this is problematic. So this is why when we look at notions of globalization, and refer now specifically to economic globalization. Globalization, of course, has existed for hundreds and thousands of years, but in the last, let's say, 200 years, from the British Industrial Revolution to the present, the post-Second World War order, etc., and now some of the issues, free trade was seen as right because you actually created the possibility, facilitated more interaction. Protectionism was often seen as the enemy, according to liberals. Why? Because then actually states don't trade with one another. There's actually, they both sides lose out. On the other hand, this is a complicated debate, because in some cases, to do free trade, you need to have developed your own industries to a certain point where you can do international trade. And even the British themselves had to protect certain industries before they could do free trade. But nonetheless, the key point here that I want to emphasize is that actually the more interaction, complex interaction, this can create better conditions. However, and this is what this point's getting at, when a state, let's say, is so dependent on its trade from the global order, so to speak, if you are thinking, let's say, in Southeast Asia, and you want foreign direct investment from various multinational corporations, actually, if there's a problem, then these multinationals, for good or ill, can take their foreign direct investment out, but also, and this is the other key point, when there's, let's say, an economic shock or some problems in one part of the world, an economic collapse, recession, even worse, a depression, this can have impacts on another part of the world. So a factory in let's say Thailand can be infected if impacted if, let's say, there's a problem in Germany or the United States as an example. So the point is that what's going on in the world in terms of economic trade and so on can be affected by national economies struggling, and then that can impact on another economy in another part of the world. So the point again is that we are intertwined, interconnected, for better or worse. But of course, it means that states, and I give the example of multinational corporations, they can struggle in certain contexts, and this has issues for labour rights, environmental protection, etc., etc. And what liberals are arguing, like Bob Cohen, and others, is that actually it shouldn't be a race to the bottom, but it can be potentially. So there's a complex relationship between domestic and international politics, and there's no clear or consistent hierarchy. As you know, for realists, in particular neo-realists, structural realists, international politics takes priority over domestic because it's more important, according to realists, particularly neo-realists. International institutions and organizations, though in some sense themselves a product of state action, actually, and this is contra realists, may come to assume an independent identity. And actually, over time, we can look at the European Union and the various institutions there as an example, come to take on a certain amount of their own, let's say, agency. So the European Commission is actually the executive of the EU, actually takes actions in its own right. Yes, it has connections with national with governments, the 27 European governments, but actually it has independence and agency in its own right. And again, pluralism, I referred to before, this pluralism literature, that there is contra elitist, which is actually that it's not all about the elites are front and center, but actually there's many different aspects that make up power. Power is much more diffuse and fluid, rather than a few groups being very, very powerful. Yes, there's power, but actually it's much more broken up. And actually, you can see how non-state actors also are playing a role in that, and so on. And again, referring to Bob Cohen and Joseph Nye, because they are the seminal thinkers here, Power and Independence, their textbook, Power and Independence. Yes, they accept some of the neo-realist premises, but they are challenging this realist pessimism, and actually saying that there is a possibility for cooperation and change. And key concepts, interdependence, complex interdependence. Again, interdependence, the more one trades with one another, economics now here as the example, the more you facilitate interaction, the more you become dependent, it makes it more difficult for you to want to have conflicts because you are dependent on one another. Complex interdependence, as you may remember from the image, one issue area affects another issue area, and it's ecosystem is entirely intertwined. And therefore we have to think about it in a holistic way. Absolute as opposed to relative gains. So again, absolute gains, both sides through interactions, and an emphasis here on economics, can benefit. It's a win-win situations as opposed to relative gains, which is more a realist premise. And finally, cooperation is possible. Not always, it's not axiomatic, it's always the case that it happens, but it's the more there's interactions between state and non-state actors, and over time, this creates the possibility for incremental progress, and so on. So liberal institutionalists, they also acknowledge, you can see the developments challenging realist premises. Look, there's been much more interdependence over the 20th century going into the 21st century between actors, state actors and non-state actors. And actually, if you look at the post-Second World War context, I referred to hegemonic stability last time. For liberals, like the British from 1815 to 1914, Pax Britannica, this notion that there's a liberal hegemon, liberal leader that sets the rules of the road, values, norms, etc. So the United States in the post-Second World War context played a leading role in the creation of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, which became World Trade Organization. It created a particular economic and liberal global order that was good for itself, of course, self-interest, but also good for others. And you need a powerful states do that, and good for liberals, according to liberals, of course, that this liberal hegemon like the United States did it. And we'll see where critical theorists are critical of that point later on. Neoliberals recognize that there are barriers to cooperation, such as free riding, and we've come across this term previously in the presentation, that there are states, and how do you overcome this collective action problem? How do you create institution regimes where all sign up and actually do what they agree to do, whether it's paying into to let's say a taxation system in the case of, let's say, domestic society, or let's say cutting carbon dioxide if we look at environmental issues on a global context. And again, for liberals, the more we facilitate iteration, the more there's interaction, the more we work together over time, it can create the peaceful possibility, facilitate change and cooperation. And therefore, we have an interest in designing institutions, rationally designing and creating them, whereby, like the European Union is a good example, it creates it where it starts to impact on all the different areas of our lives, and it spills over and plays an important role in every issue area of how we interact with one another. Silences and limitations. Like realism, it lacks clarity about the conditions and limitations of how we can expect cooperation and when conflict takes place. So there's arguably sometimes here still almost maybe that there are issues for liberals in terms of these predictions don't always take place. And according, again, this point, realist or neorealist, it's still the naivety, utopian aspect, because if you are a classical realist about human nature or neorealist, yes, international cooperation can take place, but again, power is front and center if you're a realist. And actually, it's a bit naive and also utopian that we can incrementally get to a better place, progress, because you can see the world doesn't exactly work that way. That you can see why there's conflict in the world, why powerful actors and sometimes not so powerful actors do still interact in a conflictual way. And you just need to look at the world today, according to realists and neorealists, to collaborate that point. And again, science's limitations could exaggerate the role of international institutions, that the international institutions themselves have weaknesses. And again, globalization or deglobalization right now, you might say, that the extent of globalization, well, they need to perhaps look at it and also make you look at it more critically. And we'll be looking at critical theory and more critical approaches shortly. And the limited capacity of the state, actually taking away the power of the state, especially if you're a weaker state in terms of have a weaker economy, a smaller economy. And this approach, liberal institutionalism, again, this is now we're really getting into critical theory, tends to legitimize the status quo. So that there's hierarchy in the world, that's why, in a sense, critical theory or Marxism or feminism, but we're going to go into more detail later. But let's say for critical theorists, it's just legitimizing a certain status quo and a hierarchy, and unfortunately, why there's still poverty in the world. Well, liberal institutions really need, and liberals more broadly, actually fundamentally are, in this sense, conservative with a small c, according to critical theorists. Why? Because they're happy with a particular order, as are realists. And this is where we'll be looking at critical theory in more detail to show how actually they want to change the status quo of rather than just modify it. And the European Union that we'll talk about in class, this is a case study, and arguably a positive case study for liberalism and liberal institutionalism, of how let's say these different institutions work and so on and so forth. And we'll look at this, we'll look at about how it's from the post-Second World War context to the present, the progress, the difficulties, different areas, whether let's say monetary with the euro now, or whether we look at financial, whether we look at questions of education, environment, trade, the single market, therefore, and the customs union that we can talk about. But liberal institutionalism and the different institutions that have been created and developed over time are important to how we understand and can explain the development of the European Union, arguably. We'll talk in class. And then a final, and this is a question for you to think about for class, should liberal states promote their values abroad? Is force a legitimate instrument in securing this goal? Again, from your reading, you'll see the great British English liberal of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill. You can look at his work, but a key thing, and I want you to think about, should liberal states promote their values abroad, is force, and this is a key aspect to the two questions or two parts to what we're looking at, is force a legitimate instrument in securing this goal, or is it a contradiction of liberal values? Something for you to think about. So again, thank you so much for your time and for this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you in class. All the best. Bye-bye for now.